All right, this is OPEX Sustain for energy system training on the assault rower. So sustain basically means you got to try to hold on to things and keep it at a certain pace for as long as possible. Sustain in our language can also mean aerobic. Sustain can also be oxidative. So you remember on the power time curve when we started, gain was the most amount of power and effort you can put into a very, very short period of time, right? And then pain was the next somewhat evolution of that, where we're not going as hard, but we're trying to do unsustainable activity. So we're trying to do work that we know there's going to be an endpoint to. Now the opposite of that for sustain, the whole intention is to basically keep things going and going and going over a long period of time. So in order for you to get there, you have to do what I believe to be a fundamental truth and the beautiful aspect of sustain activity is you got to do a lot of reps and you have to do a lot of volume. Now this is somewhat antiquated in terms of how people perceive aerobic ideals today, because a lot of people think aerobic ideals is really just the manufacturing of the sensationalism that comes from sweat and like breathing really hard. But really the concept of aerobic is sustainable activity. So you have to ask, well, what's the deepest intentions? And if the intentions are to learn how to be sustainable, then you have to do a whole bunch of easier, slower, patient reps with a whole bunch of volume in order to gain that aspect and characteristic of sustainability, okay? So it's no different than when we do it on other modalities, somewhat different actually with running, but other modalities that are machine-based, like we'll talk about for the Aurora, and you may have seen in the assault bike, it's pretty similar in what we're trying to gain from that. The question always asked for sustain is, why would you want to do sustainability activity? So if you do have a process in mind that you're trying to get to a goal of just conditioning, a generalized concept of conditioning, then really anything you do can lead you to be more conditioned. If you have an idea in mind of getting stronger, then if you are going from zero and you're just attempting to do something, anything you do will get you stronger. So when we are going to partake in doing sustain activity for the air rower, our concept is to show with proof that you're capable of doing more work over a longer period of time in the sequence that you wish to test it. Now our sequence we're going to test is for 10 minutes, but we're doing sustainable activity to actually be more sustainable. So the deepest intentions for you doing sustain activity is to be more aerobic. You don't do conditioning, you don't do any forms of whatever fantastic word you want to add to it in terms of what it, oxidative processes, etc., to become less aerobic. So you're not going to shorten the time frame that you're doing it. You're going to want to do it so that you can extend out and get further and further and further and perform more work over a long period of time, okay? So I put it out this way so that you don't think that just because we're dealing with shorter intervals or the perceived time domain may be questionable in terms of what we're doing for aerobic activity, that we're moving away from the deepest intentions of getting more sustainable. Because the idea with this is to become as sustainable as possible over time. And you're going to get that through repeats, and you're going to actually show progress by being consistent, which again, you can see the language is inside of the intentions there for why we're doing it. So why do sustain? We're doing it to be as sustainable as possible, okay? So if you can do this more and more over time, then you're doing it great from the get-go. Again, like some standards you can shoot for would be body weight in pounds, cals in 10 minutes. So I'm 170 pounds, then trying to get 170 cals in 10 minutes is somewhat of a real nice goal I can shoot for. So remember we had that peak wattage that we had for rowing for the gain, and then we had, half body weight pounds in cals in 3 minutes, and now we got body weight in cals in 10 minutes. These are just things you can shoot for to kind of determine if you're actually getting to that higher level of performance based upon each energy system. And as I said, the most important thing for having those standards is so that you can see where you sit in some areas. Some people may be able to hit that with no problem, but they may have years and years in service to getting stronger and doing repeats on the rower to get to the point where they can actually get to the standards for gain and pain. Some people may be the opposite. Some people may be super powerful and really good at gain, not have the capacity or the aerobic capacity as well to be able to handle pain training and be very far from achieving a standard of 10 minutes and their body weight cals in that time frame. So for those individuals, they may want to spend more of their time working on the sustainable axis to round themselves out because they are truly, in essence, more powerful, okay? And so those reasons, those standards are there from gain, pain, and now sustain is to allow you to figure out where you balance out in these areas and how far you are away from each. And now you can use that as a motivational tool to kind of round yourself out over a long period of time in training, okay? And to stay consistent, which is sustainable. So when you're going to partake in this, we're going to give you a 4-week block idea and concept to do this. So you're going to test prior to the 4-week training. The training will be the 4 weeks and then retest in the end. The test is the body weight, number of cals in 10 minutes. So the test is very similar to the assault bike, a 10-minute cal test, right? You're gonna just go as hard and as sustainable as possible, the highest amount of power you can for the full 10 minutes. Theoretically, 10 minutes is not the most beautiful score for figuring out, is it truly sustainable? I guess theoretically, the best way to do that would be to ask someone to see if they can go for 90 minutes, 2 hours. But in a lot of cases, it's just overkill for people who don't have the skill based upon it. So we try to extract some kind of idea from 10 minutes that people can do to kind of say, yeah, okay, this is what you're going to be doing for your pacing and your sustainable practice. So you're going to test that for 10 minutes, train it, and then retest the 10 minutes exactly, okay? Now your goal throughout the 4-week block, as you can see here, these are standing for times of intervals. So this is 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, and I'll explain this in detail. But you can see that as the weeks progress, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and you're going to do this 2 to 3 times a week. It's based upon the volume that you can maintain in terms of your schedule. You can see that the time frame, right, this is 20 total minutes, but the time frame of the interval gets shorter. See that? So I'm doing a 10-minute interval, and I'm doing a 7-minute interval, I'm doing a 4-minute interval, and I'm doing a 1-minute interval. So you may just figure this out for yourself, but I'll explain it to you. Your goal is to get faster, but still be sustainable in those repeats, okay? So just think about that. If you're doing a 10-minute interval, just visualize what the pace would look like for 10 minutes, right? Visualize that pace. Ironically, it's probably going to be just a tiny bit slower than what you scored in the testing. But you're going to do a 10-minute pace. Okay, visualize that. Okay, now you're progressing a couple of weeks later, and we're going to go down to, my bad, I just messed that up. This is 2-week blocks, meaning that you're going to do this for 2 weeks, this for 2 weeks, this for 2 weeks, this for 2 weeks. Because I think I said that would be a 4-week total. It's an 8-week total block. So just imagine that. For two weeks, you're doing 10 and 10 twice a week. That's 10 minutes off, 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off, 10 minutes on Tuesday, 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off, 10 minutes off Friday for another week, and now you're on the 7-7-7 for the 3rd week. Just try to visualize that pace for 7 minutes. That's going to be slightly faster than what I was doing for the 10-minute interval. Now let's fast track it. We're now a number of weeks down the road again. We're now doing a 4-minute interval. Now we're a couple weeks even further down the road. We're doing a 1-minute interval. So just visualize that. It would make no sense for you to do the exact same pace as you were for 10 minutes, right? It just doesn't make sense. So just think about that in terms of progression and overload for these 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, and 2-week blocks. The goal for you is basically to get faster as you move through this for each of the intervals. Now, theoretically, the whole concept behind this is to train what's called gears in humans. And gears will still be applying based upon the assault rower. So you want to think about it within us, with the practice that we do in aerobic training, we all have the capability of doing different forms of pace that could still be maintained and sustainable, okay? I don't know if you remember back to OPEX pain, but you remember how we had this short interval, right, for 1 minute, and then we had this big rest period? Remember, the rest period is going to be equal to the work period here. So just think about that back to pain, right? 60 seconds really hard, 60 seconds break, and you had to do it multiple times. I hope you can feel there that the 60 seconds over time is not going to be enough. So if I'm asking you to do 16 repeats of 1 minute off and 1 minute off, I hope you can understand then that the 1 minute is going to be less powerful than the 60 seconds of pain. Why? Because I have to make it repeatable. Okay? But the way you're going to get there and express this, what we would call a faster interval, the best, is you start here, right? So twice a week for 2 weeks, 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off, 10 minutes on, and you're going to try to maintain the same score for each of the 10 minutes. This is the principle for all of this, is that you have to have repeatability of each set. And each repeatable set will indicate a successful session, okay? And don't worry about doing the same thing for 3 sevens for 2 weeks in a row, and if that's 4 total sessions, you're still embedding a really good metabolic response, right? And we were to hook you up to all these physiological measures. By the end of the 2 weeks, although your scores are the same and they're repeatable, there's more efficiency going on inside metabolically, okay? So just know that that's taking place. Now when you get over to the third 2-week block, you're going to be doing 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, 5 times, right? So you can just add this up here, 20 total minutes, 21 total minutes, 20 minutes, 16 total minutes of work. And I hope that made sense, right? 16 minutes of 1 minute on, 1 minute off. So that's 16 total minutes. So think about it, it's somewhat similar in the total amount of work you're doing over the whole time, but the interval is getting faster. So that's what we're doing in terms of progression. We're doing it in 2-week blocks, but we're also doing it by increasing the pace as you go. Now, if that all sounds like way too much, the beautiful thing around aerobic training is that the training will let you know how you're doing. That's the beautiful thing about it. So let's just start right from the get-go. The first day you do it, 10 minutes on, you take a 10-minute break, and then you do 10 minutes again, and then you don't do the right amount of work. That's fine, because guess what you're going to do 4 days later? You're going to do 10 minutes again, you're going to take a 10-minute break, and you're going to try to do the second 10-minute at the same of what you scored in the first 10 minutes. If you accomplish that, you've accomplished the second session. Right? So now you move on 4 or 5 days later. What are you going to try to do? The same work again in 10 minutes, rest 10 minutes, you do another 10-minute piece. So the goal you can see is consistency. And it's not a lot of like more hard work and more, falling on the ground and trying to get to an unrepeatable area. No, you're trying to learn how to be sustainable, right? And we're putting it trying to put it in the most simple formats. For the rower as well as other machines, but for the rower particularly, just try to get the same score each set. So what do I mean by score? Well, you can measure distance, you can measure calories, you can measure distance in multiple different ways. I wouldn't just do peak wattage because that can be a little different based on what you're having for the period of time. So have those 2 same scores each time. On this next 2-week block, have the same scores for the 7 minutes. For the 4s, have the same scores for the 4 minutes, and for the 1 minutes, have the same score every 1 minute for all the repeats. If you wanted to look at it on a grandiose scale over 8 weeks, right, then what you should see is faster pace per interval, okay? Because that would indicate that because you're repeating every set, so let's just imagine that I did 310 meters, right, for a 1-minute interval. I have to do 310 meters 16 times. In one session, okay? So just think about that. Every time I finish the 1 minute, I have to see 310 on the machine. If it's 310, and then it's 309, and it's 311, and it's 312, and it's 309, that's still pretty tight. If it's like 310, 306, 297, something's happening. You're not doing repeated efforts, right? So let's just say that is the case for that N=1 scenario when the 7th week. I highly doubt that's going to happen with all this practice. Let's just say it does occur, and you do some, incorrect training the day before, your lifestyle's off, or sleep's not there, etc. It happens. If you get to that third repeat where I said 310, then you did, what was it, like 302, and then 292, just call it. Shut it down. Don't take 5 minutes and try to start again. Call it a day. 4 days later, you come back and you're starting maybe your second week on this one, or it could be even the second session of the first week. Just try to get sustainable for the entire 16 sets. That's the entire goal. But then if you're at that point, you're like, I just want to make sure that I'm still progressing. Figure out what pace you're holding for the 1 minute, and then go back and look at your notes of the pace you were holding for the 10s and the 7s. And then you should see that you're doing faster paces each time. Okay? So remember, the overarching goal, like you saw in pain, but specifically for sustain because there's so many repeats, remember reps and volume is the goal we're trying to get here, is that you show some signs of progression from this, and you also show repeatability of the same work per set. That's how you know you're doing it correctly. Okay? And then everything will work itself out. Now I haven't even mentioned effort based upon this because the beautiful thing with the guardrails that are inside of aerobic training is that if you don't repeat per set, then you're just not doing it. Okay? So we could call it 90%, which is basically just somewhat less than a hard effort for the particular time. But the beautiful thing is that the work and rest periods will allow you to stay within this zone no matter what. But we still will say that if we're looking for some magical number to put on top of it, it's 90%. Okay? So that's sustainable practice. A recap. You do sustain work, and you've got to do it with reps and a whole bunch of volume. That leads to the biggest intention as to why we do sustain work, is to be sustainable. You do aerobic work to be more aerobic. You don't do it for other things, okay? Now, a standard you can look for, body weight in pounds, cals in 10 minutes. I gave you an example. If I'm 170 pounds, that would be a really nice goal to search for there. And then I can see how it plays out on that power time curve, right? So how well I do in gain in that standard, how well I do in pain in that standard, and how well I do in sustain in that standard. In order to train this, do the 10-minute test. Train it, come back and retest 8 weeks later. I think I said 4-week blocks at the beginning, so I changed up my, my language on that. It should be 8 weeks in this training, then you come back and retest. These are going to be 2-week blocks of 10 and 10, 2-week blocks of 7, 7, 7, 2-week blocks of 5 4s, and 2-week blocks of 16 1 and 1. Then you're going to retest and see how well you score again in the total cals in 10 minutes. Same time of day, same machine, etc. As many controlled variables as possible. And then you can at least see what did you learn from all of this practice in terms of what's needed to manufacture a better score in the future. Okay? Now, you could be asking, well, what happens after 8 weeks? Is there another program you're going to come out with? Or is it... No, the whole goal will be then to go back and start over again with a 10 and 10. Right? So this is the beautiful thing around aerobic gears and expression of it. There is a lifetime of repetition in this. You could cycle these 8 weeks over and over forever and ever. Okay? And your goal over time would be to add just a little bit of effort to the scores that you have inside of that. And if you track all this data really well, you should be able to see a very easy progression to get to the ultimate goal of having multiple different gears expressed on the assault rower. And just a reminder for effort, somewhat of a 90%, but remember we have guardrails for repeatability that allow us to stay within that zone. And they're in 2-week blocks. Look at it as an 8-week plan, and you can press repeat on this sucker over and over for the rest of your life. So that's OPEX Sustain for energy system training on the assault rower.